Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're embarking on a fascinating and, frankly, essential deep dive into S.C.M. Paine's monumental work, The Wars for Asia, 1911-1949.
It's a really significant book.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And it fundamentally challenges how we, especially in the West, typically view this period. Paine argues, and I think really powerfully, that the long Chinese Civil War, the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War, and the Pacific theater of World War II, well, they weren't separate conflicts at all.
Exactly. They were deeply intertwined, like different acts in a single decades-long drama that completely reshaped Asia.
So our mission today is to really unpack this interconnectedness. We want to understand the core motivations of the key players across all these interwoven conflicts.
And hopefully pull out those crucial insights that give you, the listener, a much clearer picture of this pivotal era.
Absolutely. So where do we start? Paine's main thrust seems to be challenging the timeline, right?
That's right. What immediately strikes you is how it reframes our whole understanding of 20th century history. You know, we're so used to thinking of World War II starting in Europe 39, maybe?
Right, or Pearl Harbor in 41 for the Pacific.
Exactly. But Paine makes a compelling case that the real starting point in Asia was Japan's invasion of Manchuria way back in 1931.
1931. That really shifts things.
It shifts the entire timeline. And it forces us to see Japan's aggression in China over that decade not as, like, a preliminary skirmish,
But as the main event, almost.
as the initial crucial phase of a much larger conflict, a regional one that eventually became global.
And this perspective highlights how China's own internal problems kind of opened the door.
Absolutely. The internal struggles within China directly created the vulnerabilities that Japan then exploited.
Okay, let's unpack that then. This core idea of interconnectedness.
Right.
You're saying the long Chinese Civil War, this internal chaos, actually laid the groundwork for the war with Japan. How did that work?
Well, think about it like this. After the Qing dynasty fell in 1911, China basically fractured.
Right.
Power was all over the place. You had countless warlords. Paine mentions over 1,300 individuals who qualified as warlords between 1912 and 1928 alone.
1,300. That's staggering, just ruling their own little patches.
Pretty much. Wielding private armies, controlling territories, constantly fighting each other. This deep internal instability meant there was no strong, unified central government.
So no one could effectively resist an external threat.
Exactly. And Japan, right next door, rapidly modernizing, expansionist, they saw this disunity as, well, both an opportunity and maybe even a potential threat if China ever did get its act together.
An opportunity to advance their own interests, and a threat if a unified China emerged.
Precisely.
And this was all happening while the nationalist party, the Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek, was actually trying to unify China with the Northern Expedition.
That's right. So Japan was watching this unification attempt with growing unease, especially as the fighting got closer to their economic interests, particularly in Manchuria.
They had significant investments there.
Huge investments. Japanese leaders were increasingly worried about disruption, but also about the bigger picture, a unified China potentially challenging their regional ambitions.
They wanted Manchuria's resources.
They coveted them. Rich resources, plus they saw it as a crucial stepping stone for more expansion. This fear, mixed with imperial ambition, led a growing faction in Japan, especially in the military, to think, we need to intervene forcefully.
Secure their interests, regardless of China's internal mess.
Pretty much, assertive military action seemed necessary for their long-term national goals.
So here's where it gets really complex, as Paine lays out. By the time we get to what we usually call the start of World War II, say 1939 in Europe, or 41 in the Pacific.
China had already been fighting for years.
Right. They were caught in this incredibly messy, multi-layered conflict, a civil war.
Between the nationalists and communists.
Happening inside a regional war against Japan.
Which was itself becoming part of a looming global war. It's mind-bending.
It really is. By 1941, you've got the Chinese nationalists and communists supposedly in a united front against Japan.
Nominally, yes, the Second United Front. But underneath, their own civil war was still simmering, often boiling over. They were often fighting each other more than the Japanese.
And all this internal and regional conflict was getting tangled up in bigger power struggles.
Exactly. You had Japan, Russia, the U.S. all involved, but with different goals, focusing on different layers of this mess.
What were the main focuses?
Well, Japan was focused on consolidating its gains in China, obviously. Russia, historically wary of a strong China, They played a complicated game.
Trying to keep China weak.
Often, yeah. Supporting different factions, sometimes even the nationalists, sometimes warlords, sometimes the communists, just to maintain instability, keep China preoccupied internally.
And the U.S.?
Initially, the U.S. was focused on its open-door policy, just ensuring trade access. But as Japanese aggression ramped up, threatening broader American interests in the Pacific, they got more involved.
It's this interplay, internal, regional, global Paine, that Paine really brings to light.
That's the core of the argument.
Okay, let's dive deeper into that long Chinese Civil War itself.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Warlord Era, 1911 to, the late 1920s. Just utter fragmentation.
It was profound fragmentation. The king collapse left a vacuum, and these regional military commanders just stepped in.
Warlords.
Yeah. Their rule was often about personal ambition, constant fighting among themselves, squeezing the locals. This long period of disunity just crippled China, made it vulnerable.
You really need to understand that context to see why Japan felt it could just move in.
Absolutely.
But emerging from this chaos, you had the Nationalist Party, first Sun Yat-sen, then Chiang Kai-shek, trying to build something unified, modern.
That was the goal. Sun's three people's principles, nationalism, democracy, people's livelihood. They wanted a central government to overcome that warlord regionalism.
And the Northern Expedition in the late 20s was their big push.
It was a major step, yeah. At least on paper, it unified much of China under nationalist control. But that unity was pretty fragile.
Why fragile?
Well, lots of reasons, but a big one was the emerging Communist Party. They had a fundamentally different ideology. Class struggle, peasant revolution.
Led by figures like Mao Zedong. So even as the nationalists were trying to consolidate, they had this internal rival growing stronger.
Exactly. The Civil War initially had lots of players, but it increasingly boiled down to nationalists versus communists, and the ideological gap was huge.
How so?
The nationalists, well, they often represented urban elites, landowners. The communists, drawing on Marx and Lenin, focused on mobilizing the rural peasants. Promises of land reform, social upheaval.
Totally different visions for China's future.
Made any real reconciliation almost impossible. Their support bases were different, their goals were different.
Paine points to Shanghai as a really key spot, a financial hub, international trade center.
Yeah, Shanghai was crucial. China's main gateway to the world, huge economic activity.
And the first Shanghai incident in 1932. That seems significant.
It was pivotal. It was triggered by anti-Japanese boycotts, rising tensions, and Japan attacked. It showed they were willing to use force right inside China proper to protect their economic interests.
Even though it ended in a truce, it was a clear sign.
A very clear sign of Japan's aggression. And it further destabilized the nationalists. This happened while Chiang Kai-shek was pushing his controversial policy.
Internal pacification before external resistance.
Right, prioritizing crushing the communists even as Japan was getting more aggressive.
That strategy, focusing inward while trying to appease Japan in the early 30s. Looking back, it seems like a huge miscalculation.
Well, it's definitely one of the most debated parts of Chiang's leadership. His thinking was China had to be unified internally before it could fight off Japan effectively.
He saw the communists as the bigger, more immediate threat to his power.
To his authority, and maybe to national stability as he saw it. But yeah, this appeasement policy, it emboldened Japan. It let them consolidate their hold on Manchuria and push further into China.
Did the nationalists do anything to counter Japan initially?
They made some efforts at economic consolidation, like a currency reform in 1935, but the main focus stayed on the internal enemy, the communists. This was despite growing anti-Japanese feelings and boycotts across China. They were sort of caught.
Which brings us back to the argument that the Second Sino-Japanese War, starting in earnest in 1937, wasn't really separate. It was just an escalation of what Japan started in Manchuria in 1931.
Absolutely. Paine argues, very convincingly I think, that Manchuria wasn't isolated. It was the opening shot in Japan's long war of conquest in Asia.
Driven by what exactly? Fear, ambition, resources?
A potent mix of all three. Fear of Chinese unification, fear of Soviet expansion in Northeast Asia, combined with this hunger for resources, iron, oil, coal, especially from Manchuria.
And the military was pushing this agenda?
Increasingly, yes. The military gained more and more influence over policy, pushing for aggressive expansion. The Mukden incident in September 1931, that staged railway explosion.
The pretext.
Exactly. Used as the pretext to seize Manchuria and set up the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932.
What did the League of Nations do? Didn't they investigate the Lytton Commission?
They did. The Lytton Commission investigated. They acknowledged, some issues with the Chinese administration in Manchuria under the local warlord Zhang, corruption, disorder.
Right.
But they ultimately concluded Japan's military actions in setting up Manchukuo were illegitimate, a violation of international law. They basically said local discontent didn't justify Japar's invasion.
Did that condemnation slow Japan down?
Not really. It led to Japan leaving the League of Nations in 1933, which was a huge break with the West. It showed their defiance.
And meanwhile, Japan itself was going through turmoil, the military rising in power.
That's a critical piece. The 1930s in Japan saw this dramatic rise in military influence, especially radical army factions pushing for aggressive foreign policy, more authoritarianism at home.
You had assassinations, coup attempts.
Yeah, things like the assassination of Prime Minister Inukai in 1932 and the bigger February 26 incident in 1936, an attempted coup by young officers. It showed the military was willing to use violence, intimidation to sideline moderates.
And this internal power struggle fueled their foreign policy.
Definitely. It contributed hugely to their increasingly aggressive stance and their disregard for international norms. Leaving the League, setting up more puppet states in North China in the mid-30s, it was all part of that trend.
And there was this specific Japanese military mindset, right? Belief in willpower over material limits.
Very much so. This spirit over matter idea was deeply ingrained. Belief in the superiority of the Japanese spirit, that they could win quick, decisive victories.
Which led to underestimating opponents, ignoring logistics.
Often, yes. It led to underestimating enemy capabilities, poor logistical planning, and a tendency towards bold, sometimes reckless, military gambles. This mindset had huge consequences later when the war dragged on.
Okay, let's bring in the other big players. Russia's role seems really complex. Supporting nationalists, warlords. What was their game?
Well, Russia's main goal, historically and at this time, was to prevent a strong, unified China right on its long border.
Strong China was seen as a threat.
Potentially, yes. Russia had its own interest and influence in Northeast Asia, like the Chinese Eastern Railway. Remember the conflict over that in 1929?
Right.
So by giving support, money, weapons, advisors to different Chinese factions, sometimes the nationalists, sometimes communists, sometimes warlords, they aimed to keep China divided, fragmented, weak.
Hedging their bets, playing all sides.
Sort of. Prolong China's internal conflicts, keep it focused inward. Plus, of course, the Soviets hoped for a communist revolution and actively supported Mao's party with advisors and organizational models like the Commissar system.
And the U.S. You mentioned the open door policy wanting trade access, but they seemed hesitant to get deeply involved at first.
American policy was complicated, sometimes contradictory. The open door was about equal trade access for everyone, no exclusive zones. That naturally clashed with Japan's ambitions.
So they supported Chiang Kai-shek.
They did provide some aid, economic and military, to the nationalists. But there was also this other view among some Americans, seeing the communists almost as agrarian reformers fighting a corrupt nationalist regime.
Different perspectives within the U.S. system.
Yeah. And ironically, when Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Anti-Comintern Pact, it actually pushed Russia to give more aid to Chiang, seeing him as a buffer against Japan.
Geopolitics makes strange bedfellows. What about the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in 1941? That seemed significant.
Hugely significant. April 41. For Stalin, it meant security on his eastern front, so he could focus on the imminent threat from Nazi Germany.
And for Japan.
It removed the immediate worry of a Soviet attack on Manchuria. This freed up Japanese forces for their southward expansion into Southeast Asia. And ultimately, it paved the way for the Pearl Harbor attack.
So the pact enabled Pearl Harbor in a way.
It contributed. But the real trigger for Pearl Harbor was the increasing U.S. economic pressure, especially the oil embargo after Japan moved into Indochina. Japan saw the attack as necessary to grab the resources they needed in Southeast Asia, particularly oil.
Which loops back to Paine's point. Pearl Harbor, the event that brought the U.S. into WWII for Japanese planners, it was almost secondary.
That's the argument, almost a peripheral operation. Their main goal was winning in China and securing Southeast Asia. Pearl Harbor was about neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet to stop interference.
It's such a different perspective from the standard Western narrative.
Absolutely. And remember, the U.S. then adopted a Germany-first strategy anyway.
Right, prioritizing Europe. And even within the China theater, the Americans disagreed on strategy, like Stilwell versus Chennault.
Yes, different ideas about air power versus ground troops, how best to support the Chinese. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched major offensives like Ichigo in 1944, which devastated nationalist forces.
So what finally defeated Japan?
It was a combination. Obviously, the long, grinding war waged by the U.S. and its allies across the Pacific, but Paine emphasizes the crucial final blows. The Soviet Union entering the war against Japan in August 45.
Operation August Storm in Manchuria.
Right, a massive, swift offensive that crushed the Kwantung Army. And of course, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those factors together forced the surrender.
And the cost for China through all these decades of war.
Just unimaginable, staggering human and economic devastation. The country was bled dry.
And then with WWII over, the defeat of Japan didn't bring peace to China. It just opened the final act of the Civil War.
Exactly. Japan's defeat left a huge power vacuum. The nationalists and communists immediately resumed their fight, but now it was for total control.
What were their relative positions then, post-WWII?
Well, the nationalists, on paper, looked stronger initially. They had U.S. support, controlled the major cities, but they were weakened by the long war, plagued by corruption, and facing hyperinflation, which destroyed their public support.
And the communists.
They'd used the war years effectively, expanding their control in rural areas, building peasant support through mobilization and promises of land reform, and crucially, they got a big boost from the Soviets in Manchuria.
How so?
The Soviets occupied Manchuria after defeating the Japanese, and they basically handed over captured Japanese weapons and territory to Mao's forces. A huge strategic advantage.
So U.S. mediation efforts, like the Dixie Mission or Patrick Hurley trying to broker a coalition, they were doomed.
Pretty much. The distrust was too deep, the ideological divide too wide. Neither side was serious about power sharing. Manchuria became the key battleground.
And the communists won the key campaigns there.
Yes, under commanders like Lin Biao. They gained momentum. Meanwhile, the economic collapse in nationalist areas, that hyperinflation hitting the middle class hard, just crippled Chiang's government.
Plus the communist land reform policy, even if brutal, won over peasants.
It was a powerful tool, yes. Even if often temporary, it secured vital support. By 1949, the military tide had turned decisively. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists were forced to flee to Taiwan.
So looking back over this whole period, 1911 to 1949, nearly 4 decades of almost continuous conflict, the human cost is just immense.
Horrific suffering, economic ruin for China. And the end result was a unified China, yes, but under communist rule. This completely changed the map of Asia and set the stage for the Cold War in the region.
With huge implications, like the Korean War, U.S. policy towards Taiwan.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how different players view Japan's defeat. China emphasizes its long resistance, the U.S. its Pacific campaign, the Soviets their Manchurian offensive. Paine's work shows they were all part of the same interconnected story.
It also highlights major strategic miscalculations, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. On all sides. You mentioned Ishiwara Kanji, the Japanese officer who actually helped plan the Manchuria invasion, but later warned against getting bogged down in a wider war in China. He accurately predicted the quagmire.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Paine's The Wars for Asia, what are the really key takeaways for you, the things we absolutely need to grasp?
I think the most crucial thing is that fundamental interconnectedness. We just can't understand 20th century Asia or even WWII in the Pacific properly if we keep these conflicts in separate boxes the way Western historiography often has.
We need to see them as one continuous process.
Exactly. Japan's war in China, starting way back in 31, wasn't separate. It was the first integral phase of this huge regional and then global war. Understanding that link is essential to grasp how modern Asia was shaped and, frankly, how it still operates today.
It really is a powerful challenge to the conventional narrative. It forces a major rethink. So for you listening, what resonates most? How does seeing these wars as interconnected change your view of World War II? And maybe think about the long-term consequences. What are the most enduring legacies of that communist victory in China for the region and for the world?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's clear, isn't it, that the echoes of these long, brutal wars are still shaping the geopolitical landscape of Asia, and indeed the world, in really profound ways.